Okay. So, as I said, we're from around the world. I'm based in San Francisco, California, in the US. I'm an online tutor for this course. So I want everyone to know that as it's being recorded, we're asking everyone just to be aware of that. And also, we're going to have the structure is Professor Christoph Scherrer will give some comments on 2 questions that come from the exercises on the online course. And after each question, we'll give time for everyone to ask questions. And the 2 ways you could ask questions is either you could put them in the chat, or you could do the raise hand function and we'll call on you and you could speak on camera and ask your question. And so we'll do that. We'll have the 2 questions, the 2 discussion sessions, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have 10 or 15 minutes to have, either follow-up questions and then allow Professor Scherrer to kind of wrap up. Okay, and remember to keep your comments brief because there's quite a few of us, and it would be great if everyone could contribute and ask questions or make comments. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Professor Scherrer briefly because he is professor at University of Kassel, and he has done an online video lecture with the topic, The Dangers of North-South Trade Agreements, What Can Labor Do? So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Scherrer to first answer my first question that I'll read right now. And my first question comes again from his video lecture. And my question is, the lecture mentions that regional trade agreements, usually started by the US and the EU, and when they can't get other countries to go along with their corporate agenda, they've developed these more regional agreements. And this is clearly, coming out of the neoliberal period that we're still kind of living through. And I wanted to ask him, because this is the first video workshop of the course, and I wanted to ask him if he could give some examples historically of these regional trade agreements and kind of maybe a short chronology of when they were made, and then also the reaction to them. Because I remember in 1994 when the North American Free Trade Agreement was released, on that same day that it went into effect, the Zapatistas went public and voiced their public opposition to the exploitation they saw that NAFTA would create in North America. So Professor Scherrer, could you answer that question and perhaps introduce yourself a little further?
Yes, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'm sitting here in Berlin. The sun is shining. And as you see from my face, I just returned from vacation in Italy. And so I'll have to get into the mode to tell you something about trade. I've been watching trade for quite some while. I got interested in it concerning the United States because I noticed that over the many years in the post-war period, the general population was not so happy about opening up the United States for trade. And nevertheless, it did happen. And I found that an interesting topic, why in a democracy things are happening, even though there is not a real majority for it, and how does it work and so on. And I found out that it is sometimes an issue of salience, meaning that it is an issue of how important it is to people. And the trade details are a bit arcane, are not so easily accessible, what it actually means for working class people. And therefore it is possible then to frame trade in different ways. And so in that post-war period in the United States, it was frequently then framed as a leadership issue, kind of the US as the leader of the free world. And that somehow then made it possible that the people somehow went along with it or somehow more or less accepted. Of course, not all, and organized labor, especially then starting in the late 60s, opposed free trade. In the earlier period, they did support it because of anti-communism, trying to support the allies, but also the former enemies, Japan and Germany, in the new coalition against the Soviet Union. You know that. And so they, for that reason, they then supported opening up the United States for trade with these kind of countries. But then in the late 60s, they noticed that the corporations have made much use of it and have put labor on the defensive there. At that time, they then actually launched a major challenge to the free trade agenda pushed here by both parties in Congress, the Democrats and the Republicans under Nixon. But what then was interesting is that the corporate world, which was split for a long time on the issue of free trade, suddenly united, and they united against labor. So it became a very clear class issue, that labor against capital. And then labor made one major mistake, and perhaps I should talk more about that, because trade is not just something concerning tariffs, but it is also something concerning finance, and especially the monetary order, the international monetary order. And so labor at that time then supported Nixon's switch from a fixed rate regime of currencies, where the major currencies were fixed to the dollar, to a free floating system. And what they overlooked was that this kind of free floating and actually put more stress on labor than any kind of reduction of tariffs. So labor needs to also look at the trade agenda, always also with an eye on what's happening with capital flows and with currency regimes. But today we'll stick more to the trade and the different measures of lowering the trade barriers. What I also wanted to highlight is in the post-war period that we have a double movement, in a way, in two different directions. The one direction, which is the one which is well known, is the lowering of tariffs, and opening up economies for international competition. And this, in a way, is making it more difficult for countries to catch up, because they're then immediately facing strong international competition. So what we have then, on the one side, a situation where the protection of the latecomers, the late industrializers, is going down, is diminishing. But at the same time, and that is less than noticed in the media, at the same time, the protection of the first movers, of the strong competitors, is moving up. They get more and more protection, and that is especially around the intellectual property rights, the patents. So the ones who move ahead and making sure that the others have difficulties in catching up. So that's kind of the situation we are facing nowadays. And these regional trade agreements are key in pursuing this agenda. Now, in the economic literature, those who are hardcore free traders have not liked free trade agreements on a binational or plurinational regional level, you know that. And the key word that they use is trade diversion, meaning that if 2 or 3 countries are banding together and make trade easier for them, that the others, the rest of the world, is then discriminated against. And so they were always for multilateral rounds, meaning that the whole world should be coming along and agree on easing the trade among each other, you know that. So that's kind of the classical position. And it was also then made quite plausible because of the interwar experience, the experience between the First and the Second World War there, where we had seen then breakup of international trade there, and there we had the British and their colonies, and then we had the dollar, and then we had the German mark and so on, and then we had a few countries on gold, but there was no longer really a trade among them, that. And so in the post-war period, there was then quite a lot of emphasis on a multilateral round. At the very beginning, an attempt to have everyone on board, very much pushed by the United States Chamber of Commerce. But when they found out that many countries do want to protect their industry, which has not really been developed much, and that they also want to catch up with the United States, the US Chamber of Commerce were no longer so happy. And they then decided to have a smaller group of countries. And that's how the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs started in the post-war period with a select group of countries moving forward there. This select group of countries became bigger over time, more. And then in the 60s, mid-60s, when more and more countries and finally got rid of the colonial yoke and became independent countries, the demand came that perhaps one should have again a general worldwide agreement, and that it should be placed under the United Nations and not be a separate club, not a separate club like the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So they want to have it under the United Nations. But the rich countries were very unhappy about this demand because in the United Nations, they're a minority. And so they fought hard to keep it in there. And in the end, they won. In the 1990s, then, they were able to establish the World Trade Organization along their rules there, bringing in their General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs and keeping the United Nations out there. And so it was around that. And here comes an interesting point. So first of all, the GATT started as a smaller group, so it was not in line with the general ideas of the free traders, because not the whole world wanted to go along with it. And then it was not so easy to get the whole world into the GATT system over time. And so what the United States then did was a very clever move. They first had a regional agreement with Canada, the next door neighbor. And in that agreement, they put a lot of what they wanted for the rest of the world. And here they brought in better patent protection, meaning intellectual property rights protection, better protection for investors there, and they brought in the services, which had not been covered by a free trade agreement. And then the next step was to get the Mexican on board, and that was the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And here, the free traders who always wanted to have multilateral rules, they supported this because they saw it as a stepping stone. Before, these kind of separate trade agreements were seen as leading to a fragmented world. But over time, that changed, and they thought, well, no, actually, it could be used as stepping stones. And that it turned out it was a stepping stone. So the World Trade Organization then in 1995 then was very much informed by what had been agreed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico in this free trade agreement. So we have now in the WTO the services, the protection of the intellectual property rights. What we don't have really is investors in that. And here it's a long story. Of course, those who want to have protection as investors were not giving up there. And they were then moving on to the OECD, the club of rich countries there, and tried to push that issue there. And to much regret, as a trade unionist, our trade unionists within the OECD were sleeping, and they were not paying attention to that this would give investors much more power. But fortunately, trade unionists outside the OECD woke up, and trade NGOs and so on got very much into it, and they mobilized worldwide. And fortunately, then the French took it up, and so this investor protection didn't come through the OECD. So what is called forum shifting, then the ones who wanted to investors protection then moved to the regional trade agreement. And so what we do see is that we have a lot of investors agreement, international investment agreement, and we have in the regional free trade agreement also chapters that favor investors. So that is kind of the move from one forum to the other in order to push forward. Yeah. Now,
So could we stop here and maybe take questions? But thank you.
Yes.
Excellent overview. Does anyone want to take the floor with a question or put a question in the chat? Your opportunity to engage in discussion. Anyone so willing? Okay. Okay, then I think I'll just move on to the second question because no questions yet. Okay, so I'll move on to the second question. The second question becomes more specifically about the regional trade agreements. So my second question is, of course, as we've just heard, these regional trade agreements are pushed by the more powerful countries like the EU, the US, and in Japan. But they have an uneven effect because the level of globalization isn't equal around the world. And I would like to ask Professor Scherrer if he could explain how perhaps a country that's not as deeply involved in these agreements, and countries that still have developed are still building democratic trade unions, how they could approach this from a more basic position. So we had in the exercises, there was mention of Albania. Laura mentioned Albania still having a kind of a very young trade union movement. Now, I think you made a really important point that a lot of this involves creating awareness, building coalitions, and then putting the resources behind those efforts to try and oppose the inequality of these trade agreements. I was going to ask you if you could give some examples of where you know in the world, in the developing world, and hopefully in the global South, examples of where this is being done, where, I think it's important that the regional networks, regional coalitions, and even international coalitions need to be built. Can you give us some examples of where this has been happening?
Well, the more successful examples are with countries where the trade union movement is better established. And we have seen that in Brazil, the trade unions were teaming up with friendly academics, with NGOs, and linked it also to the issue of Brazilian sovereignty to then campaign against the US idea of a free trade agreement for all of the Americas. And that was in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And here the Brazilians were quite successful in that campaign and organizing. And really moving it a little bit just beyond the workplace, really to a sovereignty issue. Another example is that as I mentioned before, that services have been brought under the roof of the WTO there. And at the time, in 1995, many countries only opened up a little bit. And so the idea was that a few years later, one would really push for a major opening in the services there. And here then, the Public Service International, the Educational International became very active. And some of their chapters were also quite successful, especially the Australian and the British were mobilizing against opening up more the services here. An example then, South Africa. Here we have great awareness of the issue of trade, because unfortunately, the overcoming of apartheid had to be bought by opening up South Africa. Under apartheid, South Africa was quite closed there, and that had some advantages actually, because then they were able to build up their own industry and had quite some employment, for example, in the garment industry, which is usually a first entrance for people coming from the countryside and so on to get an industrial job. And what happened then with the negotiations of ending apartheid was that South Africa opened up, and in a very short time then the garment industry vanished and so on there. And so in the new round, then COSATU got of course very aware of that and mobilized then together with the Brazilians in the WTO that no further liberalizations take place. And that's also an example of a quite successful campaign that the South Africans have done, on the basis, of course, of getting to know the topic, so investing in it, and that's a big issue. Now, in West Africa, we see that the European Union has made changes to its agreement, trade agreements, and these are neoliberal changes, wonderfully framed as economic partnership agreements there. So stressing the partnership in it, but putting a lot of pressure on these countries there. And what we do find here was that the well-organized trade unions in Ghana played a major role, but then also got some support by the German foundation, very interesting, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, really then had in a couple of West African countries fora with the trade unions on trade issues, and in a very open way, while the party to which the Friedrich Ebert Foundation is linked to is more or less in support of the European approach to Africa. But the foundation deviated from that and had an open discussion. And that was a way also to raise awareness, in a way to make use of certain outsider resources. But of course, they're always extremely important that the outsiders don't really take over, that they are supportive, giving some infrastructure. And for the outsiders not to take over, you need a strong insider. And I believe the strong insider was the Ghana TUC, you know that. So that if you have and then new independent trade unions struggling more or less on the shop floor with rather little resources, then perhaps they should try to find some partners that are understandable to their issues, have perhaps similar issues there, and team up with them, and then perhaps have some donors coming from outside, but on the terms that are then more or less given by your friends in a way, you know, their neighboring friends. So that's how I would answer that. It is, of course, very difficult. Many years ago, I did this research on the impact of a social clause, a labor rights clause, in the Caribbean Basin Initiative of the United States there. And here we found that where it was a bit effective was the Dominican Republic, because it had some kind of a social dialogue in place and so on. And where it was not at all effective was in Guatemala, because the trade unions were so much under pressure, so persecuted and so on, that of course they could not really make use of that agreement and to better. So, and we called that in line with an old movie, a catch-22 situation, you know, where actually the ones who really need it were not in the position to really make use of it.
Thank you. Excellent response and some great examples. Would anyone like to ask further questions? Okay, Suzanne, Susan, could you take the floor?
Yes, hello everyone. Zoom is new on my laptop, so I'm still, I don't know, I haven't used it much, but I think I'm managing. My question is, like following what you just said, Christoph, or I think it's connected, because when I was reading these papers, or even earlier, I was sometimes wondering why still, or for such a long time, the countries agreed to those contracts. I mean, the countries from the global south. Of course, they are somehow weaker, but were they really weaker, or what was the pressure coming from? Because actually they have the things we really want and need, yeah. So why couldn't they negotiate better? Why? I mean, like the African continent is so big. Why didn't they arrange something more for themselves? I mean, they don't really need us. We need them, I would say. So I never really understood how this could get so schooled, yeah. So yeah, maybe you have some ideas. Thank you.
Well, Susanne, that's a very good question there, and not so easy to answer, but I would say there may be especially two factors at play. One is that the countries are dependent on foreign exchange. You know that. And for various purposes, unfortunately also for not so good purposes. So the elites like to drive expensive cars, and you have to import them. But you also need, for many countries, you know, foreign exchange just for the energy. Not all countries, some have surplus, but quite a number of countries energy. And if a country wants to actually catch up, it cannot so easily replicate the machinery, you know, for industry. And so it has to buy the machinery that either in Japan, Switzerland, or Germany, or the US, and there you need that. So foreign exchange is quite important. And so the exporters that are around, you know, that are there at that moment of the negotiations from these countries, they are then threatened by our countries that they might not get access. That was the case with the EPA, that was saying, well, if you are not signing the economic partnership agreement, we will then revoke the special access for your exporters to our country. And that then puts pressure on the government there. So that is the one. And the other is, I think, more ideational, that you need to really band together with others in support of a different kind of international trade regime. And especially in the 1990s, we had the neoliberal wave, and there were very few who you could tap into, you know. And the international organizations were very much in favor of the free trade. And so there was an intellectual climate difficult to avoid, you know. So kind of two things coming together, specific pressure and dependency, and an intellectual climate where you would have to invest a lot more to go against it. With the success of China, you know, this changed a bit, you know, that more and more countries saw here there's a country that stipulated under which condition they would deal with foreigners. But of course, Burkina Faso cannot compare itself to China, and doesn't have these kind of powers and to stipulate that. By the way, coming out of vacations, I read a big book on the Opium War against China in the 19th century, and it is really astounding the similarities there of today's. That at that time the Chinese also wanted to very clearly define how they interact with foreigners, and the British didn't like that at all, and then muscled their way in. And the Chinese still want to be in the driver's seat concerning how they interact with the world. And now the US is trying to muscle in, fortunately not yet with military means, but with other means trying to define how they want China to work as an economy.
Great. Any other questions? Anyone want to take the floor?
Hi.
Ramon, go ahead.
Yes, just a short. Um, uh, uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ramon Certeza from the Philippines. I remember last year, at the onset of COVID-19, there were calls from civil society organizations in Southeast Asia that includes trade union, particularly the focus on Global South, and I think it was trade justice. And they call for a, because at that time there were rumors that the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Partnership, would sign. I think it was last year, November. So there was a rumor that there is a need to really campaign against the signing of the RCEP. At that instant, there many trade unions are hopping in to campaign to prevent the signing of the RCEP. But eventually, when of course, another factor probably that hinders that signing of that RCEP was the COVID-19. I would just wonder whether if why that kind of campaign does not sustain, unlike in other region wherein like for example in Brazil, in Latin America, in South Africa, would have that kind of a sustaining campaign against the negative impact of regional trade agreements. But why I'm not really quite sure what are the factors that civil society organizations, social movements, and even trade unions does not have the sense of a solidarity among this movement, considering that those kind of economic cooperation, those kind of regional trade agreements are being driven, but of course, coming from the industrialized countries with strong economies against the least developing economies. Just thinking about, could have us, perhaps you could share some views on that, Professor Christoph?
Well, Ramon, you are a little closer to these issues than me, sitting in Berlin. But many of the Pacific Rim countries that signed up to the trade agreement with China are quite export nations. And so I suppose that this has also an impact on the civil society, that being in a country that somehow is successfully, more or less successfully managing international trade, perhaps not for all workers, but overall as the economy, that it is then more difficult to criticize that. Well, that's at least the issue in Germany, that it is not so easy to mobilize in Germany because it's an export powerhouse, and the trade unions are in a rather difficult situation. The strongest trade unions we have actually in the export industry there. Nevertheless, the trade unions have criticized aspects of the trade agreement. Unfortunately, in the beginning, more concerning the labor chapters, but over time also about other chapters in it that are not so helpful for workers also outside of Germany, or not just for Germany there. But I think that's one of that. And so I believe the trade issue needs then to also be framed slightly differently. You know, on the one hand, one really has to show how it might impact the working class there, that even if one is a bit successful in international trade, that there are costs for that. And then one has to really point out probably more that these kind of trade agreements have a long-term impact of challenging the power balance to undercut labor even more than it is currently the case. So that one really tries to highlight specific aspects of these trade agreements. But this is rather difficult to do without local knowledge. You know, you really have to understand the political situation in each country a bit, and what kind of slogans might resonate with people. For example, in Germany or in Great Britain, you would have never guessed sitting at your desk that the issue of how chicken are dealt with has become a major issue. You know, that was somehow resonating with people, that the US is not caring about how the chicken is raised, and then at the end it throws the chicken into chlorine, and then it is safe for consumers. You know, that. And this issue then really got a lot of people mobilized in Britain and in Germany. You know, that, and I think quite rightfully, but nevertheless, you would never have thought about it ahead of time that exactly this topic is which one is really mobilizing a lot of people. So to find out what is really mobilizing a lot of people, you need first of all to do some good research. How does the discourse function in the country? And you have to try things out, I think. It is not that you can really know that ahead of time so well. You have to find your way, what kind of things might get people more involved. You know, there. And that, of course, always means that if the trade unions or NGOs are interested in the topic, they need to invest a little bit more than what is usually done there.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 minutes left, and we have time for perhaps another question or two. Does anyone have any further questions? And if not, I would like to ask a question, because in the background paper, I discovered Veolia. Now, Veolia is a French company that's gone around the world and privatized water systems, waste disposal systems, and here in the US, transportation systems, which kind of ties into the video lecture about how the mobilization of taxpayers would be very useful to create these coalitions, because where I live, most of the money for the transportation system is publicly funded, but in the case of Veolia, the profits are privatized. And I think that's a really interesting angle, is to help people, you know, as you said, the research and making the awareness it affects us not only as workers, but as taxpayers and consumers. I wanted to see if you can give some other examples, because I was very inspired in the case of Slovakia when the Dutch insurance company tried to sue and say that a national health program impinged upon their profits, and then that was refused. So I found that inspiring. Could you talk about any possible coalitions between workers, taxpayers, and consumers?
Yeah, I think it is very key in the field of services. And this is where international trade negotiators are usually pushing for, to opening up more the services, to then link it up to other topics. And I found it extremely interesting when I was involved in the anti-GATS campaign in almost 20 years ago in Europe, that it was a very obscure group in the European Union that was most against it. And this group was the Assembly of the European Regions. And almost every European country has minorities in there. Even Germany, which most Germans don't know, but we do have a small group in Eastern Germany that speaks a different language, traditionally, traditionally a different language there. But in other European countries, that's very prevalent. And they were so afraid that the service trade agreement would make it very difficult for their languages, their culture to survive. And so they became one of the key players within the European setup against the services agreement there. But of course, with the privatization, here one needs to be very careful. One really has to show how infrastructure can be run by the public in a good way, because what is happening frequently is that in advance of the privatization, the public is running down that. So one has to have an eye on the managers of public infrastructure even before that there. And but it is really then a good issue to mobilize then the ones who are making use of the services. We have seen strikes where then in the public sector, where also hospitals and so on, where then the communities were also in support, even though the communities are aware that it is not so wonderful, of course, to have a strike in a hospital for the patients. But certain ways were found to find a compromise that it was somehow tolerable for the patients, but that the community knew that in the long term they would be better off if they resist the privatization issue there. Concerning the taxes, that's another issue for countries in the global south, because the import taxes, the tariffs, are quite important for the public budgets. And if those tariffs are removed, then the question is who is filling the budget gap there. And frequently the rich are trying to avoid to be the ones. So one also has to link this up. So I think really a campaign from a trade union point of view, first, of course, has to address the workers there, its members, and to how the members as workers are maybe affected by it. And then also have to show how they might be affected as consumers and taxpayers. So that there is, the effect of consumers and taxpayers is also helping to move out of the corner where your opposition, the capital side, wants you to stand. They want to isolate you and say, well, it is just a very narrow interest here that the trade unions are representing. But if you can link it up with taxes and consumer issues, then you link it up to broader issues. And it is not just that. It is only the very immediate concerns of your membership.
Yeah, great point. I think we have a few minutes left. Are there any other questions? If not, Well, we have about 4 minutes left. Last comments, questions, any other opportunities to discuss this important topic?
Well, perhaps I have a question to the audience. Are you participating in this massive open online course from the Global Labor University that is organized by Edlira, sitting here on my left corner? Are you also inscribed in that course? Also, the ones who I don't see, are you somehow participating? Sahu, Di Leon, Vopa, and so on. Yeah, Aisha, yes.
Yeah, as one of the online tutors, Ramon has been really prolific in making comments, which we're all thankful for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So some of you are also participating as tutors.
No, I'm a participant to that course as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also a participant. I was having bad network connection, so some of the media I was getting a bits and pieces of this presentation. But I also look forward to sharing of the recording, if any, so that it might also assist me and a participant in that global course.
And Jokanaya, where are you based? Where are you from?
I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm based in Harare.
All right, welcome. Great to meet you. How about the rest of you? Suzanne, where are you based?
Sorry, I'm a bit slow. I'm still in Hamburg, but I'm waiting to be sent to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, as a counselor for social and labor. I'm waiting for my visa, so I'm still here, but I'm already packed baggage.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you become part of the Foreign Office.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Very good. Unfortunately, the country is in a bit more difficulties nowadays than just 2 years ago.
I will try my best anyway.
And Sarpaswar, I remember you from the previous course. Where are you based? And you're mute. You're still mute. You're still mute.
Oh,
there you
hi.
go. There.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I'm based at Ahmedabad, Gujarat, India.
Oh.
Great to see you again. Okay. Well, with that, go ahead.
Actually, I was ill for last 3 months, so I couldn't participate in the previous course effectively. But I was getting all the mails from about you and your works also. So now I'm okay. Thank you.
Good to see you. I'm glad you're healthy. Okay, I think that's time to finish up. So I want to thank Professor Scherrer for really a brilliant presentation and for his brilliant work and the video lecture and the background papers. It's all been really useful for me. So I want to thank you greatly for your contribution to this. And I want to thank everyone for coming and taking time out of your day. And I want to remind you, I'm here in the US where we have today is our Labor Day. Unlike the rest of the world where it's on May Day, which in some ways was sparked by the Chicago martyrs at Haymarket, this country's made the wrong decision not to make it an international event to celebrate workers, but it's just the same, our Workers' Day. So thank you everyone for coming. And remember to go back on the course and take the course and take the lectures and take the quizzes and contribute to the exercises. And I want to thank everyone and have a great day.